Hey Lake Point, Pastor Michael here to get you caught up on the 6th week of our series, Faith That Works. It's a series where we're taking a look at the reigns of Jesus' half-brother, James. Why? Because we want a faith that is practical and meaningful, a faith that actually works. And James provides us with a framework for just that. This week, we're exploring a faith that does good deeds. And to kick things off, Nate shared the results of a study from several years ago. The study showed that the lifestyle activities of Christians were statistically the same as those of people claiming not to be a Christian. Gambling, viewing pornography, stealing, gossiping, consulting a medium or a psychic, engaging in violence or abuse, using illegal drugs, lying, getting revenge, drunkenness. The researchers found that there was no statistical difference between a Christian and a non-Christian in those 10 areas of lifestyle. The only activity that was less common for Christians, and this isn't a joke, is that Christians recycled less than non-Christians. Needless to say, that's kind of embarrassing. However, it does give us some insight into why the world loves calling Christians hypocrites. They see people who go to church and claim to be morally upright, and yet they look, sound, and act and live like everybody else. And it's this very issue that gets James frustrated and motivated to write what we read in James chapter 2, verse 14. He says, "What good is it, dear brothers and sisters, if you say you have faith, but you don't show it by your actions? Can that kind of faith without works save anyone?" Now, it's vital that we pause there and clarify something really, really important, because sometimes when people read this, they think that James is kind of contradicting what the Apostle Paul writes. When he writes this in Ephesians, Paul writes that God saved you by his grace when you believed, and you can't take credit for this. It is a gift from God. Salvation is not a reward for the good things we have done. I mean, Paul says it's a gift you could not earn nor deserve. It's not based on what you do, it's based on what Christ has done. And it's why on the cross, Jesus says, "It is finished," which means the work of salvation is complete. There's nothing left for you or I to do other than to put our faith in Jesus, God's Son. Salvation is not Jesus plus baptism, or Jesus plus trying harder, or Jesus plus good works, or Jesus plus tithing, or Jesus plus speaking in tongues. It's Jesus plus nothing. It's about us putting our trust, our confidence, our hope, our faith in Christ alone. And remember, James and Paul were friends. They were colleagues. They were partners in the gospel. And in many ways, James served as Paul's pastor. And although what they write about faith is different in emphasis, it's complementary rather than contradictory. They're describing two sides of the same coin. Nate shared it this way. He says, Paul wrote about how to know you're saved. Meanwhile, James wrote about how to show you're saved. Paul wrote about the root of my salvation. James wrote about the fruit of my salvation. Paul wrote about keeping Jewish laws. James wrote about living like Jesus. And their writings are complementary. They're not contradictory, which is important to keep in mind as we read the next thing James wrote in chapter 2 of his letter. He says this, he says, "Suppose you see a brother or sister who has no food or clothing, and you say, 'Goodbye and have a good day, stay warm and eat well,' but then you don't give that person any food or clothing. What good does that do? So you see, faith by itself isn't enough. Unless it produces good deeds, it is dead and useless." James says, unless it changes you and changes the people around you, what's the point of your faith? He then goes on to say, now some may argue that people have faith, others can have good deeds. In other words, there are two different ways to live out Christianity. One is through your beliefs and the other one is through your behavior. And some people believe that both are acceptable. In kind of an oversimplified way, this kind of describes the church at large, even here in Leamington, where you've got, kind of left-leaning Christians, maybe more liberal-minded Christians, where it's all about social justice and doing good. And you've got right-leaning Christians, kind of more conservative-thinking Christians, where it's all about doctrine and theology. And so James, he pushes back, because remember, he knows Jesus as good as anyone, and he writes this, he says, "How can you show me your faith if you don't have good deeds?" He says it's not one or the other, it's both. Think of a fruit tree. Where does the life come from? It comes from the inside, from the roots, which are invisible to the eye. But the evidence of that internal life is what happens on the outside. It's the fruit that grows on the tree. It's why James writes this in verse 18. He says, "I will show you my faith by my good deeds. And then later in verse 26, he writes this. He says, just as the body is dead without breath, so also faith is dead without good works. James says, you cannot separate the two. Grace is how you know you're saved. Good works is how you show you are saved. Grace is the root of our salvation. Good works is the fruit of our salvation. It's why the Apostle Paul, after telling us this in Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 to 9, he says, God saved you by his grace when you believed, and you can't take credit for this. It is a gift from God. Salvation is not a reward for the good things we have done. It's why Paul goes on to write this in verse 10. He says, for we are God's masterpiece. He created us anew in Christ Jesus so we can do the good works he planned for us long ago. God always intended for us to live a life of good works. This is made possible through the new life that we receive in Christ. As Nate shared, essentially everything James shares in these verses boils down to this. We can either have a faith that is real or a faith that is counterfeit. I mean, there's two types of counterfeit faiths and one type of real faith. The first kind of counterfeit faith that Nate addressed is a dead faith. It's a faith that is all about lip service and no lifestyle. This is a faith that really doesn't have any legs to stand on. You say all the right things, share a lot of posts on Facebook about how Jesus is the only way, but then you don't back it up with real, genuine living. In other words, your tree is pretty empty. The branches are bare. Why? Because you're actually more rooted in conservatism or traditionalism or religion than you are in Christ. Because Jesus said when you are rooted in him, you're going to bear fruit. The second kind of counterfeit faith that Nate looked at is demonic faith, which is a faith that is rebellious and not really repentant. Now, anytime you use the word demonic in a sentence, it sounds very dark and evil, but what Nate meant by the word demonic is simply the way that James used it. Jesus shared with us how demons are God-fearing. They know who God is. They are aware of his power and holiness. Likewise, they are keenly aware of who Jesus is, how he's the Messiah, God's Son. I mean, think of it this way. Demons in the New Testament have a better theology of Jesus than most Christians today. Their issue is not a lack of understanding. They have lots of head knowledge. Their issue is with their lack of obedience. They are rebellious and non-repentant. That's really what demonic faith is. James says that neither approach, dead faith nor demonic faith, demonstrate authentic faith, which is why James says that we need to have a faith that is dynamic, a faith that is genuine and growing. It's when you allow Jesus to live in you and through you. It's not you operating in your own strength to do good works in order to earn God's approval. No, it's Jesus at work in you and through you. And the evidence of that, of Jesus at work in you and through you, is one thing: love. Because Jesus was all about love. In fact, he made it really simple. He said, you want to know what real faith looks like? It's this: love God, love people. That's what makes a faith dynamic. Well, friends, consider yourselves caught up. Enjoy working through the discussion questions. We'll see you next time.